It was the summer of 1971, and two British women, Margaret and Pauline, decided to take a road trip across France. They had planned this holiday for months, dreaming of quiet country roads, charming villages, and rustic inns where they could rest each night. The plan was simple. They would drive during the day, stop for food in local cafes, and sleep in whatever small hotel they found along the way. It was meant to be a peaceful, carefree adventure. Neither of them could have imagined that what awaited them would defy explanation, a mystery that even today remains unsolved. On one particular evening, after hours of driving under the burning summer sun, they began to grow tired. The roads stretched endlessly through fields of golden wheat and rolling hills, with no towns or gas stations in sight. The fuel gauge in their little car hovered dangerously close to empty, and their stomachs growled with hunger. The sky above was beginning to fade, the bright blue giving way to a mixture of orange, purple, and gray as dusk slowly set in. The silence of the countryside was broken only by the steady hum of the engine and the occasional chirping of crickets from the tall grass that lined the road. Margaret sighed, brushing her hair out of her face. "We should have stopped earlier. We're in the middle of nowhere." Pauline kept her eyes on the road, gripping the wheel tightly. "Don't worry. There has to be something ahead. A hotel, maybe even a little inn. People live out here. They must." Just as the worry began to settle in, they saw it. An old, crooked sign by the roadside. The letters were faded, the paint chipped away by years of sun and rain, but they could still make out the words. Hôtel de l'Auberge. An arrow pointed down a narrow dirt road that disappeared between a line of tall, dark poplar trees. Relief washed over them. Pauline turned the car and drove slowly down the path, the tires crunching over gravel and loose stones. The trees rose high on both sides, their branches swaying in the wind like arms reaching for the car. The deeper they drove, the more it felt like they were being swallowed by the forest. Shadows stretched across the path, and the golden light of the setting sun barely reached the ground. After several minutes, the road opened up into a clearing, and there before them stood a small village. At first glance, it was beautiful, almost picturesque. Cobbled streets wound between stone cottages with thatched roofs. Wooden carts creaked as horses pulled them slowly. Lanterns glowed faintly on posts, their flames flickering in the wind. Children ran barefoot, laughing as they chased each other, while women in long dresses carried baskets of food from the market. But as Margaret and Pauline looked closer, a strange unease settled in their stomachs. Everything about the village looked old, too old. The clothes, the houses, the carriages, even the way the people spoke to each other. It was as though they had stepped into another century. Pauline slowed the car and whispered, "This doesn't make sense. Where are the cars? Where are the streetlights?" Margaret tried to laugh it off, though her voice trembled. "Maybe it's some kind of historical reenactment. You know, like a festival? They're all dressed up for the tourists, but there were no signs of tourists. No cameras, no curious visitors, no vendors selling souvenirs, only villagers who turned their heads to stare at the small car as it rolled past, their eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and something else, something Margaret couldn't quite name. At the center of the village stood the hotel, a tall, two-story stone building with ivy crawling up the walls, its wooden shutters half closed. A sign swung gently from rusty chains, creaking in the breeze. The windows glowed faintly with the warm light of candles or lanterns, and the faint sound of a violin drifted from inside. They parked outside, and for a moment, neither of them moved. The air smelled of smoke from wood fires, mixed with hay, earth, and something faintly metallic. It felt heavy, as though the village itself was watching them, waiting for them to make a move. Finally, Pauline opened the car door. "Well, we can't sleep in the car. Let's at least check it out." Inside, the hotel was dim and quiet. Oil lamps hung on the walls, their flames casting shadows across the wooden floor. The air was cool, smelling of old wood, candle wax, and something faintly musty, like a house that had stood unchanged for decades. The furniture was heavy and carved, the kind of pieces you might expect to see in a museum, not in a working hotel. On the walls hung portraits of stern men in military uniforms and women with pale faces, their painted eyes following the two women as they walked. The innkeeper appeared suddenly, as though he had been waiting for them. He was tall, thin, and dressed in clothing that seemed to belong to the late 19th century. A white shirt with billowing sleeves, a dark vest, and trousers held up by suspenders. He greeted them warmly, speaking French in a polite but oddly old-fashioned accent. Margaret, who knew a little French, struggled to understand him. His words were not quite the French she had learned at school, but something older, something she had only ever read in books. The man led them to a room on the second floor. It was simple but clean. A wooden bed with thick blankets, a wash basin, and a single oil lamp flickering on the bedside table. There were no electrical outlets, no light switches, no telephone. Only silence, broken by the soft groan of the floorboards beneath their feet. Margaret set her suitcase on the bed and whispered, "This is so strange. Do you notice? No electricity, no running water. What kind of hotel is this?" Pauline nodded slowly. "I don't know. But maybe it's just old-fashioned. We'll leave tomorrow morning." That night they dined in the hotel's main hall. The long wooden tables were crowded with guests who looked just as strange as everything else in this place. Men wore uniforms with shiny brass buttons, boots polished to a dull gleam, and women wore dresses with lace collars and sleeves that reached their wrists. They spoke softly, their accents thick, their mannerisms formal. The food was hearty: roasted chicken, thick bread, cheese, and red wine poured from earthen jugs. But everything tasted different somehow, earthier, richer, as though it had been prepared in another time, with recipes long forgotten. At one point, Margaret leaned toward a man at the table and asked, in her broken French, where exactly they were. The man paused, looked at her with strange, piercing eyes, and smiled faintly. "Vous êtes en sécurité ici. Dormez bien," he said. "You are safe here. Sleep well." Later that night, as they lay in their beds, the silence outside pressed against the walls of their room. There were no car horns, no radios, no airplanes overhead, only the chirping of crickets and the distant barking of a dog. Pauline whispered, "Something isn't right here, Margaret. I feel like we've stepped out of our time." Margaret tried to laugh, but her voice shook. "Don't be silly. It's just an old hotel. Tomorrow we'll laugh about all this." But deep down she knew something was wrong, and in the morning when they stepped outside, the truth would begin to reveal itself in ways neither of them could have ever imagined. The morning light crept slowly through the shutters of their room. Margaret awoke first, blinking against the pale glow. For a moment she forgot where she was. The wooden beams above her head, the heavy quilt tucked tightly around her, the faint scent of smoke and wax. It felt like waking in a dream. She sat up and glanced at Pauline, who who was still asleep, her face pale against the pillow. The inn was strangely quiet. No footsteps echoed in the hallway. No doors creaked open or shut. Margaret slipped from the bed and padded softly to the window. She pushed the shutters apart and looked outside. What she saw unsettled her more than the night before. The village lay still beneath the morning sun. Men walked with buckets of water balanced on their shoulders, horses clopped steadily down the cobbled street, and women knelt outside their cottages, scrubbing clothes by hand in wooden basins. A boy ran past carrying a loaf of bread, his bare feet slapping against the stones. Not a single car, not a single electrical wire, not even the faintest hum of modern life. It looked like a painting come alive. Pauline stirred and joined her at the window. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Finally, Pauline whispered, "It isn't just the hotel. The whole village. It's wrong. It doesn't belong to now." Margaret tried to reason it out. Maybe we stumbled onto some kind of historical reserve, a place where they lived the old way, cut off from modern life. That must be it. But even as she said the words, they sounded hollow. After dressing, they went downstairs to find breakfast. In the dining hall, a young woman in a plain dress served them coffee in heavy clay mugs and thick slices of bread with cheese. The coffee was strong, almost bitter, nothing like the modern taste they were used to. Margaret attempted to ask about paying the bill, fumbling with her French. The young woman only smiled politely, as if the question itself made no sense, and gestured for them to eat. As they ate, they overheard snatches of conversation from nearby tables. The villagers spoke softly in French, but the words were odd, archaic, outdated. Pauline leaned closer to Margaret. "Do you hear that? It's like they're speaking from the past. I can barely understand them." After finishing, they decided to explore the village. They walked slowly down the cobbled streets, their shoes clicking against the uneven stones. Everywhere, eyes followed them. Children pointed, whispering. Women paused in their chores, watching silently. Men leaned on wooden carts, staring without speaking. There was no hostility, but there was something in the stares, curiosity, confusion, as if Margaret and Pauline themselves were out of place. At the market, stalls overflowed with vegetables, meat, and handmade goods. But nothing looked modern. There were no plastic wrappers, no tin cans, no brands. Everything was wrapped in cloth, laid on wooden boards, or carried in baskets. Coins clinked as villagers exchanged them. Old coins that Margaret had never seen before, stamped with designs long out of circulation. Pauline touched Margaret's arm. "Look at that. Those coins, they're not modern French francs. They're old, really old." They wandered further, hoping to find a phone, a gas station, anything familiar. But there was nothing. Just more cottages, more stairs, more silence. Eventually, they reached the edge of the village where the dirt road stretched back into the forest. Their car was still there, parked awkwardly beside the inn, but now it looked completely alien, a strange machine from another world in a place that should not exist. Uneasy, they returned to the inn to collect their things. But when they opened the door to their room, they froze. The suitcases they had left neatly on the bed were gone. In their place lay two small wooden chests filled with clothes they had never seen before: long skirts, lace blouses, stockings, and leather shoes. Margaret pulled out one of the garments and held it up with trembling hands. Pauline shook her head. "This isn't funny. Where are our things?" They rushed downstairs to confront the innkeeper, but when they entered the hall, he was gone. The desk where he had stood the night before was empty. Only a single candle flickered on the counter, its wax dripping slowly onto the wood. Panic began to rise in Margaret's chest. "We need to leave. Now." They hurried outside, intending to jump into the car and drive back the way they had come. But when they reached the clearing, their hearts sank. The dirt path that had led them into the village was gone. In its place, thick grass and trees stretched as far as the eye could see. The road had vanished, as though it had never existed. Pauline grabbed Margaret's hand, her voice breaking. "This isn't possible." "We came this way. We drove down this path." It was here Margaret felt a chill crawl down her spine. She looked back at the village. The people still moved about, their lives unchanged, as if nothing strange had happened. But now, she noticed something else. None of the villagers smiled. Not one. Their faces were solemn, their eyes dark, their movements mechanical. Suddenly, a little girl broke from the crowd and ran toward them. She stopped just a few feet away, staring up at them with wide, unblinking eyes. In her small hand, she clutched something metallic. Slowly, she opened her palm and revealed it. A coin. Margaret bent down and took it, turning it over in her hand. The date stamped on the metal made her blood run cold. It was 1891. Pauline whispered, "Margaret, we're not in 1971 anymore."
Their hearts pounded as they leaned against the wood, gasping for breath. But even as they stood there, they could feel it, the presence. Something had followed them. They rushed back through the corridors, desperate to find their room, their car, any escape. The hallways twisted and shifted, leading them in circles. The inn no longer obeyed the laws of space. Doors led to places they had not seen before, a room filled with broken clocks, all ticking in unison, a library of books written in languages they could not read, a chamber where a single candle burned, its flame blue instead of yellow. The deeper they went, the more they realized the truth, they were trapped. When they finally stumbled back into their room, the oil lamp flickered weakly on the bedside table. Their suitcases were still gone. The wooden chest of old clothes remained. And on the bed lay something new. 2 dresses. Laid out carefully, as though waiting for them. Margaret whispered, her voice cracking, "They want us to stay." Pauline shook her head violently, tears streaming down her face. "No. We can't. We're not part of this. We don't belong here." But as they stood frozen, staring at the clothes, the lamp flickered again. The flame sputtered and died, plunging the room into darkness. And in that darkness, a voice whispered. Low, cold, and close enough to feel its breath against their ears. "Now you do." The room was swallowed in total blackness. Margaret's trembling hand fumbled across the bedside table, searching desperately for the oil lamp. But before her fingers could find it, the flame reignited on its own. It burned brighter than before, casting the room in a pale, sickly light. The dresses on the bed were no longer old-fashioned garments. They were their dresses. Margaret's green travel dress. Pauline's gray coat. Perfectly folded, perfectly placed, as if someone had taken them while they slept and laid them out just to remind them there was no escape. Pauline backed toward the door, but it creaked open before she touched it. In the hall stood the villagers. Silent, waiting. Men, women, even children. Their faces were blank, their eyes wide and dark. They didn't move, didn't blink, didn't even breathe. They simply stood there, filling the corridor wall to wall. Margaret's voice shook. "What do you want from us?" The villagers did not answer. Instead, they parted slowly, creating a path that led back down the twisting corridor. At the end, the old man with the cane stood waiting. His eyes gleamed with something ancient, something older than the village itself. Pauline grabbed Margaret's hand, her nails digging into her skin. "Don't go. Don't follow them." But the old man raised his cane and pointed toward them, his voice echoing down the corridor, low and commanding, "It is time." The two women were forced forward, step by trembling step, until they reached the banquet hall again. This time, it was no longer empty. The long wooden table was filled with villagers, seated in perfect silence. The food on their plates was untouched, steaming and fresh, as though it had been waiting for centuries. At the head of the table sat the cloaked figure from the mirror. Its face was hidden in shadow, but its presence was suffocating, heavy, pulling at the air itself. Margaret's knees nearly buckled. She could barely breathe. Pauline clung to her, whispering frantically, "This isn't real. This isn't real." But it was. The cloaked figure raised a hand, and in unison, every villager turned their head toward the two women. The movement was sharp, unnatural, like the snapping of necks. Their eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. The figure spoke, its voice deep, layered, as though more than one voice spoke at once. "You entered our village uninvited. You walked the streets, ate our food, and slept beneath our roof. By right, you are ours now." Pauline shook her head violently. "No. We didn't know. We didn't mean to." The figure slammed its hand against the table. The plates rattled, the walls shook, and the villagers began to chant in a low, rhythmic murmur. Words the women could not understand, words that crawled under their skin and filled their bones with dread. The old man stepped forward, holding the coin Margaret still clutched. He placed it on the table before the cloaked figure. The figure touched it, and the metal hissed as though burning. When the figure lifted its hand, the date on the coin had changed. It now read, 1954. Pauline gasped. Margaret stared, horrified. That's our time. That's when we came here." The cloaked figure leaned closer, and though its face remained hidden, its words carved into their minds like knives. "Now you belong to us, and to every year before." The villagers rose from their seats in perfect unison, their hands stretching toward the women. Margaret and Pauline screamed, backing away as the cold, lifeless hands reached for them. They tried to run, but the walls shifted, the hall stretched, the doors vanished. There was nowhere to go. The villagers closed in. The chanting grew louder, a storm of voices drowning their cries. Margaret's last glimpse was of the cloaked figure rising from its seat, towering over them, its shadow swallowing the room whole. Then, silence. When? Years later, long after the village had been marked as abandoned on official maps, a group of travelers stumbled upon it. They were hikers, curious explorers who had lost their way in the fog of the mountains. At first, they thought the place was nothing more than a ruin. The cobblestone streets were cracked, the roofs caved in, weeds and ivy crawling across the walls. But the inn still stood. Its sign swung gently in the cold wind, though no breeze stirred the trees. The door creaked as they entered, and they laughed nervously, calling out, expecting nothing more than dust and silence. Instead, they found the banquet hall. The long table was set, gleaming plates laid out neatly, as though a feast was about to begin. The smell of roasted meat lingered in the air, impossibly fresh, defying the rot that choked the rest of the village. One of the travelers, a man named Robert, stepped closer to examine the portraits on the far wall. They were remarkably preserved, their colors vivid despite the years. He froze. The portraits weren't of nobles or long-dead villagers. They were modern. The faces staring back were of two women, their clothing strange, out of place, as though they belonged to another time entirely. Their eyes were wide, their expressions twisted in horror. The other travelers crowded around. Someone muttered, "They look real. Too real." And then, a whisper echoed through the hall. "Welcome." The plates rattled. The candles flared to life one by one, filling the hall with that same pale glow. And in the flicker of the light, the villagers appeared. Silent. Watching. Filling the empty seats once more. The travelers ran. They didn't care where, didn't care how, they only needed to escape. The corridors twisted, the stairs looped endlessly, every door leading them back into the hall, back to the portraits, back to those eyes staring, pleading, warning. One by one, their voices were swallowed by the chanting. When rescuers finally came weeks later, they found the hikers' equipment scattered on the forest edge. but their bodies were never discovered. Back in the village, in that same hall, 2 new portraits had appeared on the wall. Freshly painted. Perfectly detailed. The inn had grown again. And so the village waits, patient and hungry, hidden behind the fog. Every decade, every year, it claims a few more. It feeds on those who wander too far, who step off the map, who ignore the warnings whispered by locals. Some say if you listen carefully in the stillness of night, you can hear them, the footsteps of travelers forever walking the endless corridors, the whispers of the villagers chanting in the dark, the faint sound of a cane tapping on stone floors. And if you're unlucky enough to ever find yourself at the edge of a forgotten village, with an inn that should not exist, with doors that open by themselves, with portraits that seem just a little too real, you'll know the truth too late. The village is always waiting. And once you enter, you never truly leave.